I'm the graduate assistant for campus ministry and social action, along with my co-moderator, Alana Pons, who is a work study student, but I'll let her introduce herself. We will be moderating this panel, and we are going to first introduce all of the panelists, and then we are going to ask them a series of questions that they are more than well enough prepared based on all of their work that they've already done in that time. And we're going to have them answer those questions for you so that you may be prepared to have a better understanding of the intersection between the environmental justice movement and the racial justice movement, and you can take the steps that you may want to take in the future to help either one of those movements or both of them intertwine. So, Alana, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Alana Pons. I'm a third-year economics student. So I thought of this event because I wanted to create a conversation within our campus community on the relevancy of how harmful environmental changes can have an incredibly harmful effect on marginalized communities of color, especially within our own New York City areas. To start off, again, we're going to have our introduction to our panelists. So I'm going to start with Jennifer Scarlott. So she is a Bronx Climate Justice North activist and coordinator of two Northwest Bronx community organizations whose missions overlap. So Bronx Climate Justice North and North Bronx Racial Justice. Jennifer has been an activist most of her life, but began to be a social justice movement organizer in 2014 in the lead up to massive People's Climate March in New York City. She has spent most of her career working for human rights, social justice, and peace nonprofits, but has found her true home in movement organizing. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. Great to hear. Thank you. I will bring snaps for everybody because all of your work is, again, so amazing. So I'm now going to introduce Professor Tekeya Sears. Dr. Tekeya Sears is an assistant professor and public health program director within the Department of Kinesiology. She has over 10 years of public health experience within her field of sexuality health, health education / health promotion, mental health awareness, and STD/HIV prevention among women of the African diaspora. Furthermore, Dr. Sears is a current member of Kappa Delta Pi International Honor Society in education and serves as a board of trustee for the Partners of Health Foundation located in Montclair, New Jersey. Dr. Sears would like everyone to know that the environmental justice and racial justice are very much interconnected. Both of these are contributing factors to health disparities seen within the communities and country we live in today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.
Next is Dr. Pamela Chasek. She is a professor and chair of the Political Science Department at Manhattan College and advisor for the Model UN program. She also co-founded and executive editor of the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, a reporting service on United Nations environment and development negotiations. She has published extensively on global environmental politics, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and other environmental issues.
Thank you.
And our last panelist is Professor Jimena Gonzalez. Dr. Jimena Gonzalez is Assistant Professor of Economics at the O'Malley School of Business at Manhattan College. She is from Bogota, Colombia, and moved to the U.S. for her undergraduate and graduate education. She has a PhD in economics from Iowa State University. At Manhattan College, she teaches multiple environmental economics electives at both the undergraduate and MBA levels. Her research agenda focuses on promoting conversation behavior through policies and nudges among different decision makers, including students at Manhattan College and farmers in Iowa. So snaps. So now I'm so excited. Sorry, I'm giggling because I'm so excited to have you all here. So we're going to start off with some questions. And before I start asking the questions, I basically wanted to make clear to the other people who are attending this event, we are going to ask each individual panelist a question, and they're going to answer it for us. And then if any of the other panelists want to answer as well or give their opinions on the question, they are more than welcome to do so. So our first question is for Ms. Jennifer Scarlott. We wanted to ask you, are you seeing more of a convergence between the traditional white environmental groups and the people of color movements?
So I certainly am. And I just wanted to start out by, first of all, thanking you for inviting me to participate. It's an honor to be on with all of you. It's an honor to be on with all of you academics and students. I'm coming to you as an activist and organizer, but I know many of you do a lot of that work as well. I've been very excited by the activism actually at Manhattan College. I'm a resident of Riverdale and know a few students and faculty at the college. I've been excited to see the debate around the possibility of renaming the Raymond Kelly Center, which I think is a very important, discussion for you guys. So yeah, I know I don't have much time, but I do want to approach this panel with sort of the caveat that I cannot call myself, I wouldn't presume to call myself an EJ activist and organizer. I am really a climate justice organizer, and for me, the difference lies in the fact of sort of what my background is and where I live and the work I'm able to do. EJ is very much grounded in community. It's very much grounded in, doing battle with local polluters, and working from the grassroots up, in communities that are suffering environmental racism. My background as a Riverdale resident and as a person of comparative privilege has really been more in the climate movement. What I have done with EJ folks in the Bronx has been incredibly important to me and to the two organizations I work with, but we very much work in partnership with organizations, particularly in the South Bronx, which is a true EJ community. So yes, just quickly to get to the question, I shifted from being a lifetime activist to adding real social movement organizing to my work in 2014. I mentioned the People's Climate March in my bio because that was an important moment in time where the climate movement was beginning to, frankly, wake up. The sort of traditional white climate movement and environmental movement was waking up to the fact that it was missing out on key components of environmentalism and of environmental racism and environmental justice. And, as that began to happen, just as an example, the organizers of the People's Climate March, it was a far more diverse group of folks, leaders around New York City and grassroots activists and just regular folks around the city than in previous big organizing efforts. So, for example, just in the Bronx, there were community activists in the South Bronx with a whole range of not just environmental groups, but social justice, economic justice, groups that came together and gave themselves the name of Bronx Climate Justice as a coalition. And those folks, if you look back, if you do an internet search for photographs of the People's Climate March in New York City, it was those EJ folks and mainly youth of color from the South Bronx who led the march, which had about 500,000 people in it. So that was a really important breakthrough, that organizing and that recognition by many white activists and organizers that they were missing a crucial piece of the picture in not collaborating and deeply understanding, the sort of the racism that underlies, the environmental movement itself and environmental policy and all the rest of it. So just bringing it quickly to the current day, there was on September 20th, there was a march called the March for Climate Justice Through Racial Justice. that was spearheaded by a working group of the People's Climate Movement New York, which arose out of the organizing for the 2014 People's Climate March. And that working group has really, specifically is now specifically working to link racial and climate justice together, and from folks from diverse backgrounds in a far more explicit way. So bringing in economic demands, housing demands, indigenous people's demands, all the rest of it. So yes, there's a real change, a real profound shift happening. The March on the 20th highlighted demands of the Black Lives Matter movement for defunding police, as well as indigenous people demands for renaming Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day, all under the rubric of climate and environmental justice. So very intersectional. Sorry if I went over a little bit.
No, we love it.
No, that's perfect. So you mentioned the link between race and environment. So Dr. Pamela Chasek, what kind of role does race have in the sitting of these toxic and polluting facilities in the country and in New York City?
Well, what we found is that overall, many natural gas plants, toxic chemical facilities, and others happen to be sited near where people of color live. How that started was when urban areas were developing across the country, zones that were, every city, every place has zoning, what's allowed to be there. Are houses allowed to be in one place? Are factories allowed to be in another place? Commercial zones, etc. And what they found was that zones reserved exclusively for residential purposes were often expensive. Meanwhile, mixed-use zones were more affordable, but they also allowed residential and industrial buildings to be built side by side. And so this led to a higher population density in areas closer to environmental hazards, just based on the affordability. Interestingly enough, this issue came up last night in the presidential debate when Kristen Welker asked specifically, she said, people of color are much more likely to live near oil refineries and chemical plants. In Texas, there are families who worry the plants near them are making them sick. She said to President Trump, your administration has rolled back regulations on these kinds of facilities. Why should the families give you another 4 years in office? He did not respond to that question. Joe Biden did respond and explained that talking about when he was growing up in Claymont, Delaware, and that there are a number of oil refineries along that part of the Delaware River. Someone needs to mute. Jennifer, could you mute as well?
Yeah.
So sorry about that. And so he responded, about oil residues on, his mother's windshield when she was taking them to school in the morning, and the health impact facilities. As a result, they face an elevated risk of cancer due to air toxics. Let me try that again. Air toxics emissions from natural gas development, and over 1 million African Americans live in counties that face a cancer risk above the EPA's level of concern from toxics. And this largely goes back to that zoning issue. The other thing that you find is that more of these facilities tend to be built in those areas because they discount activism from those communities. When you have people who are poorer, regardless of race, but especially of people of color, that environmental issues are usually not at the top of their priority list. And making that link between environmental hazards and their health concerns. We see, parts of the South Bronx near Hunts Point, you see very high elevated rates of asthma among children and people who live in that part of the Bronx. Why? Well, you've got a lot of truck traffic going through there for the Hunts Point market, which is where all the food that comes into Manhattan and other parts, particularly, are there, and then all the trucks delivering in them in Manhattan pick it up there. You also find a disproportionate amount of waste transfer stations in that part of the Bronx, which also leads to heavier truck traffic. So it's not just the siting of polluting facilities like natural gas or chemical plants, et cetera, but it's also, truck traffic that's going through and the emissions from that traffic.
Concept is so important when thinking about it for the next 4 years, and who we elect is obviously incredibly important in terms of thinking about how this is going to be put into the minds of the individuals in office, and depending on who you elect is very important. Not to get too political, because nobody likes that, but I wanted to move on and ask Professor Tekeya Sears, because Professor Pam Chasek asked or briefly mentioned the issue of asthma, and I know there's a lot of other health implications that have happened because of the damage that has been done to the environment and to the climate as well. So we wanted to ask you, what are some of the health implications of these polluting facilities in the NYC area?
Okay, so I was when Pamela was speaking, that just brightened me up, because those are definitely things that I was going to touch on as well. But especially from a public health standpoint, when you think about there are what we call health disparities, and health disparities are differences in burden of a disease. So you often see that there are differences between, you know, people of color and those who identify as white or any other particular race. So what's happening in, for example, like as Pamela mentioned, asthma is very prevalent in urban communities, as well as lung cancer. You're seeing a disproportion of lung cancer, especially due to tobacco-related products, due to people, being in environments where they're exposed to different types of air quality, they're exposed to hazardous waste, they're exposed to lead contamination, and unfortunately, yes, it has some partial to do with the zoning. I'm not from New York. I live in New Jersey, and I'm from New Jersey. And growing up I grew up in a town that was near Newark, New Jersey, and where Newark, New Jersey has a lot of factories, a lot of you see a lot of for example, there's a docking where people who fish come to dock there in Newark, New Jersey for fishing purposes. You see, and you still sometimes see, for example, again, a lot of factories in the air quality. The air quality in comparison to Newark, New Jersey is very different to where you see some places known as like Montclair, where it's more suburban, or you compare it to some place as, for example, Riverdale, where the composition of the community is very similar to a suburban community in comparison to Newark, New Jersey. And that's what I see as traveling from New Jersey to New York. So you're seeing that a lot of these health risks are now increased because what they're exposed to in the environment. What happened in Newark, New Jersey with the lead contamination in the water, people had to boil their water to drink, to have clean water. So you're telling a family or families who are under a certain socioeconomic status, who do not may not have the means to, they may only can afford boil water, actual tap water, use tap water. They now have to find the means to boil their water. They now have to find, in terms of when they're brushing their teeth or taking a shower, like those things happen in urban communities, and those contribute to poor health outcomes. We're seeing an increase in poor health outcomes in people of color. We're seeing people, especially when it comes down to recently COVID-19, you're seeing that there's disproportionate numbers and disparities between people of color and any other in comparison to their white counterparts. You're seeing that, and it's happening due to lack of education. Also, people coming together and working together. I know I'm going to go into another one of my questions, but coming together to advocate for their health. One thing that I tell my students is that you have to be an advocate for your health. You have to, be able, when you go to the doctor, to ask questions. If you do not have to take if you go to one particular primary care physician and you only can afford to go to that primary care physician, and you don't have to take their word as gold. You are allowed, you have the right to go to see a second opinion. But some people don't know that. Some people, figure that, okay, well, if what my doctor is telling me is in my best interest, but sometimes it's not of the best interest. What we know is that the healthcare industry is a business. And when you see people being treated differently due to, different disparities, education level, income level, insurance level, their death rates that we see disparities in, that grows, an eyebrow that we have to do something. And how are we going to close that gap? How are we going to come together as a community? Because it's not only just one person's problem, it's the community's problem, because people are dying. People are, their quality of life is starting to reduce because of these different types of health issues. So I hope I answered the question. Thank you.
Yeah. So far, like what we've heard is that there are real life or death health implications for these toxic facilities if it's not anything small. So something that I learned in economics with Dr. Jimena Gonzalez is that there are real ways that these facilities can cut costs and still decrease the amount of pollution that they're emitting. So just for a few minutes, I would like Jimena Gonzalez to talk about these market-based solutions.
Thank you, Alana, and Casey for organizing this. First, I would like to say that I am an environmental economist, but my research expertise is not in environmental justice, but I do think that this is a super important topic. I think is getting more attention within environmental economics. So I am bringing my perspective as an environmental economist, explaining some of the policy tools we have available. So first, I would like to start by saying that pollution is a negative externality, and if that negative externality is ignored by decision makers, by some of the firms that were listed by Dr. Sears or Dr. Chasek, then the market fails. So, there's a misconception that markets work all the time, but when we have, and that may be the case when we have perfectly competitive markets that are efficient, but it is also very important to recognize when markets fail and how to improve the market outcome. Within environmental economics, we have a set of policy tools. Some of them may be command and control, although we prefer more incentive-based solutions. But in essence, the goal is to bring the external cost of pollution back into the market through either taxes or pollution trading systems. So some of the things that were listed as health costs or health consequences about drinking water, all of that is ignored by the market. So it's important to have ways to bring those costs into the decision makers. And some of that may be through regulation. It is probably the most effective way to do it is to just have regulation, whether it's taxes, trading systems, or even subsidies to incentivize the adoption of cleaner technologies. But by pricing the pollution, we basically reduce pollution and incentivize the adoption of greener technologies. This is connected to some of the debates that are happening at the political arena where they keep talking about coal and older technologies, but we really should be incentivizing renewable energy. So it is very important to do that. Some of that may require some cost in the short run, but as technologies are developed, we're going to get better solutions. I also want to point to some other ways to address some of the environmental problems that is connected to behavioral interventions, such as nudges, to improve or encourage environmentally friendly behaviors that are very low cost. I am saying this because we are facing an economic conditions that are unprecedented. So even though I, as an environmental economist, I would push for more regulation, I also understand that businesses are struggling substantially. So I want to also try to think outside the box and think about solutions that would be lower cost. So nudges are basically simple interventions that don't change the choice architecture that decision makers face. Let me give you a couple of examples. By changing, let's say, the default printing setting to double-sided, paper usage could be reduced. I have a research paper showing that at the college. Other default nudges include not giving plastic straws to customers unless they ask for it, instead of being the default that everybody gets one, or reducing plate sizes at buffets, or not giving plasticware for takeout. Right now, like, a lot of people are ordering out, like, where people are not going to restaurants, but think about all the pollution that comes from that. We could do some nudges to change that behavior. But there are also other nudges like peer comparisons their energy reports showing the consumption relative to neighbors. And if a person receives an energy report showing that the consumption is higher than the average or the comparable neighbor, then that person has decreases the electricity usage. So again, given current conditions, I think thinking about nudges is a good way, just because businesses are struggling. After the pandemic is over and the economy recovers, I do think that we should recommend more harsher or more effective regulations. There's more need for regulation, more need for greener technologies to internalize the cost of all of the negative things that are not part of the market.
Yeah, one of these.
That was awesome. Oh, wait.
Yes.
Sorry. That was great. And I really appreciate having the economic perspective being brought to this table and to, to this discussion, because it's so important to think about when you're trying to make these changes, even in your daily lifestyle, like thinking about the economic benefits and opportunity costs to that as well. And you mentioned the renewable energy resources, and I thought that was great. I was recently reading, I thought I'd mention it briefly, about a town, Somerset, Massachusetts, that was a big coal town, and they were very invested in the coal industry. And it was like everybody in the town's livelihood, and they had recently shifted to wind energy, and they had significantly seen an increase in jobs. They'd seen an increase in the amount of money that each individual was being paid, because they were making so much more money from wind energy. And they had seen an increase in the health benefits from that as well. The people that were working in these coal factories, when they switched to working in wind energy, their health had significantly improved. So I really appreciate you talking about that, because there's so many different positive benefits when you think about the economic factors of the environmental movement and how we can truly help people within these communities through renewable energy. So not to keep on going on, because we have more questions for our panelists, but I appreciate that, Professor. We wanted to move on to ask Jen Scarlott, how do you pose the issues to people when organizing in low-income and politically disenfranchised communities, especially communities with very little open space or access to natural areas? Oh, your mic. It happens to me all the time.
Yeah, I appreciate this question, because it actually gives me an opportunity to push back on it slightly, on the wording. And I deliberately didn't want to rephrase it, because, again, this gets back to the way I answered the first question about sort of defining or describing myself as a climate justice organizer who works in partnership with my friends in the EJ movement. Again, I wouldn't go into an EJ community and try to tell people what to think or what to do or how to, so the task of someone like me, as somebody who is not living in an EJ community, is to, if I have the opportunity to partner with folks who want to partner with someone like me, is to listen, learn, discover what is needed for them from me, what's helpful in partnership. But folks in EJ communities have got to be driving the bus, not folks like me from outside. I would say that there's a really important document that particularly white people in the environmental movement and the climate movement should know about, which is called the Jemez Principles. It was created some time back, and maybe folks could do an internet search for it, or I could provide a link later on. It was created by EJ and CJ groups, to help really ground environmental justice work in diversity, inclusion, partnership, those kinds of principles. And it's really, really crucial that white folks working on EJ issues base their work that way. It's also increasingly important that we do anti-racism work, both on ourselves individually and in our organizations and coalitions, and sort of decolonization work. So some of that is increasingly happening to greater and lesser, extent and success. My daughter, my young adult daughter, was recently working for an organization that does a lot of environmental work called the Union of Concerned Scientists, and she had a number of colleagues, young colleagues of color. One in particular who left the organization because she was so disturbed at the sort of tokenization of young people of color within what are called the big greens. And there's a letter that she publicly wrote about her experiences at UCS that is very instructive about the ways that, the big green organizations that have been historically white-led and very much, dominated by sort of a white culture of ways of doing things, the mistakes they make in excluding a more, excluding folks. So, I would just tell a very quick story that I think is a little instructive. When Bronx Climate Justice North got started, one of our members came to us who was living in Marble Hill, which is up here, very close to Riverdale. She was living along the train tracks there, and very concerned for years that CSX, the freight carrier, would idle trains there for long periods of time. Commuter trains were idling there for a long time as well. So a white Riverdalian who happened to be married to somebody who had a connection with a higher up executive at CSX got this executive on the phone for us. I brought in on the call other people with Bronx Climate Justice North, including a very important EJ activist named Michael Johnson with a group called South Bronx Unite. And we had long conversations with this CSX person and also with Metro North about the EJ issue of these idling trains, spilling fumes, dangerous, air pollution into Marble Hill, which is largely a community of color. What happened is kind of a sad tale. Because of the connection that this Riverdalian had to the higher ups at these rail companies, their solution was just to deal with it by quickly moving the idling train phenomenon to the High Point section down near the South Bronx, which, as Pam and others have described, is known as Asthma Alley. It's heavily burdened already by, encircled highways and buses and trucks and all the rest of it, the waste transfer stations. So their solution was to move the trains away from Marble Hill, but to another area that is even worse impacted by air pollution. And they did that almost, at the snap of fingers of white folks in Riverdale who had connections. And we said, no, this is not the solution. The solution is not to burden our neighbors who are even worse impacted, than folks up here are. And they said, sorry, that's it. We have to idle trains in the Bronx. If you don't want us idling them in Marble Hill, we're going to idle them in High Point, and that's it. End of discussion. And so that was a incredibly discouraging way I have to say, to begin our work, and it was very instructive in terms of who has the power in our society. You know, I would also just quickly say in finishing that, you know, there are many groups on the cutting edge of EJ work who feel that market solutions are not what is needed, that capitalism is racist by definition, racial capitalism, and that, you know, as important as individual actions are, in terms of not using straws and driving hybrid cars and all the rest of it, climate change is again a train barreling down the tracks. It is upon us. You know, people first and worst, people on the front lines are dying. And we need radical economic solutions. So an organization, say like Cooperation Jackson in Mississippi, that works on, you know, Black self-determination and real true economic democracy, are, for me and others like me, very interesting organizations to look at in terms of thinking towards the future economically on EJ issues. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Dr. Sears, so I'm a native to the Bronx, and some of the health implications that you were talking about, a lot of my friends have been exposed to, particularly asthma. So my question for you is, what solutions or, you know, how can we prevent a lot of these health problems in our communities?
So one thing I can say is how can we make the community more aware? What can we do to make the community more aware of what's taking place? Because they may not know what's taking place in the actual community. You know, you say you come from a community in the Bronx, correct, Alana? You're in a community in the Bronx where a lot of people experience asthma. Now, they may not see it as, okay, well, my household experiences asthma. The household next to mine, the household down the street experiences the same. They may not see it as that. They may see it as, okay, well, my household, someone has asthma. And the numbers of asthma, of people who experience asthma, it's a lot. A lot of people experience this type of, and I don't want to say illness, but what they experience is asthma. So one of the things is to make people aware about what's happening in their community. Community organizing is very important. So communities coming together because they understand that there's a need. So one, you have to make them aware of what's happening in their community, but also they have to come together. When you're trying to get communities to come together to implement change in a community, some best are oftentimes is not for outside people to come into the community and tell you what to do about your community. It's for us now as public health, and what we call this in regards to, we do community needs assessments, is that we have people from the community on our team, because you know that community, the ins and outs of your community. So while we have the professional background of, okay, this is what we think is the best way to alleviate or to help this problem in the community, we can't do that. How would you feel about us coming into your community saying, you need to change this? You'll say, well, who are you? Why are you doing this? So having people on our team that from the community is very important. I tell my students in my intro to public health class that one of the things, the best things to do is to have the person, for example, if everyone knows the crossing guard at this corner and that corner, she knows everyone's business, she's known you since you were a kid, it's important to have her on your team. It's important to have the people who are valued by the community members on the team, because they know what's going on. They know the ins and outs. So coming together in community organizing is building awareness and trying to build an infrastructure that's now going to say, well, the community is aware of what's going on, and we're going to fight for our community. They have to do that through advocacy. They have to write, their mayor or their councilwoman, because oftentimes when it comes to funding when it's coming from the government to those urban communities, you have to think about that they may not take that same money, that pot of money, and put it those resources to environmental justice or into environmental change. They'll put those resources more towards education and more towards hospitals and but the thing of it is that if you take that same pot of money, you bring awareness to an issue that's taking place in that community, and now you try to channel that funding towards that issue as well. Now you can bring awareness to it. So it's all about coming together and organizing. You feel that in your community that you need this to change, you can bring about change. Talk to people, have that, a town hall meeting where people are coming together and they're actually talking about the issues and what can we do. Not thinking about, well, is so-and-so's problem or so-and-so's problem. This is our community. We have to be the ones to raise our voices for this, because no one's going to care until we care. No one's going to, in my opinion, I believe that no one's going to care about certain issues unless we bring about those, we care about this issue. We care about that there's so many people suffering from asthma, or the cancer rates are so high, that the water, the idea of not having access to clean water in 2020 is very, very troubling, especially in a country such as America, where, for me, my family, we come from South America. So my family's from Guyana, and coming to this country, coming to America, it's an American dream to get a job in America, do all these things for your family in America. Your family makes it coming to America. So you think about how so many issues are taking place, especially health issues are taking place in the communities in America, is very troubling. You notice, over time, that the life expectancy for first generation, so for example, I'm a first generation Guyanese American. So my parents who have migrated to this country, they have a higher life expectancy. By research, they have a higher life expectancy because they did not grow up here. Because they did not grow up here. However, my life expectancy, even though I'm their child, my life expectancy will by research is to be lower than my parents because of the accessibility to resources, the food, my environment that I was exposed to living here in America. And when I when I have children, it'll be the same thing that trickles down from generation to generation and what we're exposed to. So I believe that us, one, is creating awareness of this issue and how much we can do by creating that awareness. But people may not even know that their air quality, what we call the AQI, air quality index, that sometimes the air quality is very different if you look at it in comparison to cities and neighborhoods, and even from state to state, from New York City to even to New Jersey, it's very different. And how you're being exposed to toxins are very different depending on where you live. So making people aware of what's going on and how they can be an advocate for change for themselves is very important. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We appreciate that. And like I said beforehand, especially with the elections coming up, it's important to think about these different topics and not only voting, but also advocating for yourself and for your communities in the aftermath of those elections and being able to give your communities a voice. So I appreciate that a lot. But now we are going to move on to Dr. Pamela Chasek. You had mentioned earlier that you had co-founded and were the executive editor of the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, which is a reporting service for the United Nations. And you clearly have extensive work in discussing environmental issues at a very high level. And so we wanted to ask you, how has the environmental justice movement changed the environmental movement as a whole, in your opinion?
Well, it hasn't come fast enough, but I'm just going to put together a few little sort of anecdotal evidence on this. I wanted to, before I did that, I wanted to go back to something that Dr. Sears said, just to take her point about clean water and just move it globally. And so just to put things in context, 790 million people, about 11% of the world's population, do not have access to clean water. And more than 1.8 billion, which is about 25, a quarter of the world's population, doesn't have access to sanitation. And so we're talking about toilets, we're talking about wastewater. And so that's just something, this is very much a global issue. And inevitably, the people who are suffering from the least access to water and clean water and sanitation happen to be in poorer communities, and most of them are communities of color. And so environmental justice is, a worldwide issue. The disparities we see in the United States are replicated around the world. But moving back to your original question, so I started my first real job after college was working for the National Wildlife Federation, which is the nation's largest conservation education organization. And so one of the things when I was working there that we did was we started up an environmental justice office, and we were one of the first ones in the country to do so. And the person who was brought in happened to be a person of color who was very active in that movement in Buffalo, New York. And he was the only African American working in the headquarters office at that point, and which reflects the sort of the birth of the modern environmental movement as a whole. When you're looking at sort of the national organizations, is that, and this for students who are here from my classes, we talked about it was, a bunch of white men, rich white men, no less, were the ones who had the ability to be interested in the environment, be interested in outdoor spaces, be interested in these issues. And most of these organizations were founded and run for many years by the equivalent of your, wealthy white men. And so while that's changed over time, the change hasn't been enough. And when you mention to people in different communities about, are they concerned about the environment, in poor communities, community of color, you do not see that level of interest because it's associated with not with their communities. And so they'll see it as a health issue, but not as an environmental issue. And the two come hand in hand. And one other little point is I want to bring out the outdoors aspect of the environmental movement as well, is that traditionally communities of color are not the ones who are you going to see who are going to go on, long treks on the Appalachian Trail, or are going to go out and do outdoorsy activities that we think of. Are they going to go canoeing? Are they going to go, whitewater rafting? Are they going to go hiking? And so, and we saw one of the concerns that the community has, we saw in full color this summer, actually back on Memorial Day, when Chris Cooper, who is a well-known birder in New York, I happen to follow a lot of birders on bird Twitter, and it's made my Twitter feed so much nicer during these times. But so, Chris Cooper was birding, and he asked a woman to put her dog back on a leash in the Ramble in Central Park, which is one of the best places in New York City to go birding, in Manhattan at least. And she refused, and she called 911 to say that he was threatening her. And one of the biggest issues that you have is that people are wary of particularly Black men who are out doing something in nature. And I have a friend in Oregon who's been with the Oregon Shakespeare Festival for 26 years. He is a well-known actor, well-known in the community, and he leads a weekly Monday hike. Every single Monday, snowshoes in the winter, hiking in the summer, and hopefully, and he's African American, and he finds himself in sort of a minority. Everybody else who's on the hike with him is white, yet he's the leader. And if he wasn't with a group of people would, be afraid of him. People would challenge him. People would call the cops on him. And so one of the other aspects of this, beyond the pollution side, is that there are a number of birding groups. There's a whole thread of Black birders on Twitter. There's a lot of African American and people of color hiking groups that go out because there's power in numbers there. But we need to also make the outdoors a more friendly place for people of color to recognize those issues as well.
I agree. And I think that is a good point that you bring up, is that there are a lot of people, especially in communities of color, who are afraid to venture out in communities that they're unfamiliar with. Speaking as a person of color myself, from my opinion and perspective, I know for every individual it's different, but introducing the concept of the not only just the environmental justice movement, but the environment as a whole and in and of itself, to these communities of color that are so frequently used to urban areas and urban cities, and showing them the beauty and opportunity, but also affording them that opportunity to be able to experience things like that. And, you know, even like remembering when I was in school, there were a lot of opportunities that I had in terms of going out into the environment for my science classes, like learning all of these different things about the environment in my science classes that I would think about. And it's like, does every class learn about these different environmental issues? Does every class learn about these different opportunities through the environment and the beauty of the environment in and of itself? And so I appreciate you mentioning that, because there are so many different classrooms that don't get to experience that. And I think starting that education at a younger level for all students is a really important topic to discuss as well when thinking about the intersection of environmental justice and racial justice. But I will let Alana ask the last question.
So this question goes to Dr. Jimena Gonzalez. How do we, from a business perspective as an economic student, value profit but also value the environment?
Thank you, Alana. First, I want to comment quickly to something Pam brought up, which is the need for sanitation. And I want to give an example of the power of behavioral economics in solving some of these issues. In India, there was an issue with the lack of usage of toilets. And even though there were campaigns trying to inform people about the benefits of toilets and promoting them, that wasn't really working. What worked was a nudge telling women who were about to get married, hey, you need to find a husband that would have a toilet. They changed the social norm, and it had a huge impact. It was very inexpensive, and it had the impact of increasing the adoption of sanitation and toilets in India. And these behavioral interventions are very important right now because budget constraints are really limited. And we have businesses that are struggling to survive, so we need to think about that. But I would like to now answer the question. I think first, some businesses are starting to recognize the demand for greener products, and they are providing that in services. People are demanding them, and they're businesses that are profitable, that also care about the environment. This trend is likely to continue as younger generations are more conscious about sustainability and climate change. So that's a good side of it. But at the same time, there are many businesses that are ignoring the environmental costs in their profit calculations. And it is important that those businesses will start taking those into account. It's probably very hard to do that now due to the pandemic and the current economic conditions. But I do think that producers and consumers should consider environmental costs and understand why policymakers are using so many environmental regulations and policies. We have many policy tools available. We have command and control policies. We have also incentive-based. I'm going to give some examples to show the power of these policies and how effective they have been. The plastic bag ban in New York City, I think, is very visible to us, but it was due. I don't know why it took so long, but that's an example of a very command and control policy that was very, very effective. Refrigerants that were their pollution is much higher than CO2 also were banned, and that has also been proven to be effective. We also have incentive-based approaches such as taxes, subsidies, or pollution trading systems that also have been effective. Examples of this include subsidies for solar panels. This is one where even though the current administration is trying to not go with solar energy and renewable energy, the market is still working. It is still being pushed. Like, it's not going to stop even if regulation is being removed. The markets are already going. And in California, despite the lack of the removal of regulation, some of these markets are still pretty strong and are creating jobs. Same with subsidies for green roofs, the adoption of cleaner technology. All of this will help move us towards a more sustainable future. The government may also impose a carbon tax. This is one in which consensus among economists is there. We are very much in favor of a carbon tax. There are countries and cities that have implemented a carbon tax, such as Canada. They have achieved both economic growth and at the same time decreased greenhouse gases. Some of these carbon taxes could be revenue neutral, and the dividends can be given back to the population. And this giving back could also have a redistributive effect. So it could also help decrease inequalities that exist in some of the cities or countries. Lastly, I want to talk about one last incentive-based measure, which is the pollution trading system, or known as cap and trade. Basically, the government has an objective, an abatement goal, and then it sets some permits. And then the market works, the permits are sold and bought, and then the basically pollution is priced in that way. There are examples of cap and trade systems that have worked in California, in the Northeast with RGGI, in the European trading scheme. All of these are examples in which the economy continues growing, and at the same time, we have a reduction in CO2 emissions. I'm saying this because we have a system in place. Markets not always work. It's important to understand that, but we also need to understand how markets have incentives so that we can reverse that, and we can use the market incentives to correct the failure and promote a more sustainable environment. But my conclusion is that it is critical that we have a joint effort between businesses, consumers, and the government. Regulation is very important to attain a more sustainable future that is better for everyone in society. Thank you.
That was awesome. If you see me looking down, it's because I'm taking notes on everything that the four of you are saying. And I want to say that this does conclude our panel today. So I want to thank our panelists so much for coming. When we thought about this event, we thought about it much further in advance than you would think. Consider how much every single day we were, running around, like I said earlier to the panelists, like chickens with their head cut off, like trying to make sure that this event went perfectly. But we both look up to all of you and your work so dearly, and we appreciate you being here today with us and taking the time to give us your answers and showing us how important the environmental justice movement and the racial justice movement intertwine is so important to our society today from your perspective and from your work. So I want to say snaps for you. I'm a very big snapper on Google Meets,